The massive ship hung in space like a metal moon above Earth, and Commander Vexitar stood before the viewing screen with his arms crossed behind his back, watching the blue planet spin slowly below them, and he felt nothing but mild disappointment at what he saw through the advanced sensors. The humans had detected their arrival 3 days ago, and their primitive radio signals filled with panic and confusion reached the Zephyrian vessel in steady streams, and Vexitar listened to some of the transmissions with his science officer Kilnash, who shook his large head at the crude technology. "Their weapons are chemical-based, Commander," Kilnash said while reviewing the sensor data. "They still use metal projectiles fired from tubes, and their most advanced missiles move slower than our personal transport pods, and their energy output readings are barely registering on our equipment." Vexitar nodded and moved to the tactical display where red dots marked every military installation on the planet below. And the numbers were laughable compared to what the Galactic Coalition had faced from other species, and even their most primitive member worlds had shown more advanced defensive capabilities. "What about their space capabilities?" Vexitar asked, though he already knew the answer from the preliminary reports. "They have launched a few small craft beyond their atmosphere, but nothing that could threaten even a maintenance pod," Kilnash replied. "Their fastest ships would take them several hundred years to reach their nearest star, and they have no energy shields or advanced propulsion systems." Down on Earth, Captain Jake Morrison stood in the command center at Edwards Air Force Base and watched the alien ship through the most powerful telescopes humanity had ever built, and he felt a cold fear settle in his stomach as he realized how completely outmatched they were. Lisa Harper stood beside him, holding a tablet filled with analysis data from the first contact attempts, and her face showed the same worry that everyone in the room felt, and she looked up at the main screen showing the massive vessel that dwarfed anything humans had ever constructed. "They responded to our radio signals within minutes," she said to Morrison. "Their translation of our languages was perfect, and they seemed to understand our technology better than we do. And when we asked about their capabilities, they just said we would see soon enough." Morrison had been a fighter pilot for 15 years before moving to the contact team, and he had faced dangerous situations many times, but nothing had prepared him for this moment, and he knew that every weapon Earth possessed would be useless against technology that advanced. The first meeting was scheduled for noon, and Morrison could see the landing area outside where hundreds of reporters and government officials waited behind security barriers, and the whole world was watching through live broadcasts as humanity prepared to meet their first alien visitors. At exactly 12 o'clock, the alien ship sent down a small craft that moved without any visible propulsion and landed as gently as a feather on the prepared landing pad, and 3 figures emerged wearing flowing robes that seemed to shimmer with their own light. Commander Vexitar walked forward first, and his tall frame and gray skin made him look almost human, except for the large, dark eyes and the way he moved with perfect balance. And behind him came 2 other Zephyrians who carried devices that hummed with quiet energy. "I am Commander Vexitar of the Zephyrian Exploration Fleet," he said in perfect English. "I speak for the Galactic Coalition of 12 advanced species, and we have come to discuss Earth's future in the galaxy." Dr. Harper stepped forward as Earth's chief representative, and she tried to keep her voice steady as she welcomed the aliens and asked about their peaceful intentions, and Vexitar listened politely before gesturing to one of his companions. "We will demonstrate our capabilities so you understand the situation clearly," Vexitar said, and the second alien raised a small device that projected a shimmering barrier of energy between them and the human delegation. Morrison had seen this coming, and he signaled to the military units positioned around the area, and they opened fire with their best weapons, and the bullets and explosive rounds struck the energy shield and simply vanished without leaving any mark on the barrier or affecting the aliens behind it. "Your projectile weapons cannot penetrate our basic personal shields," Vexitar explained calmly. "Our ships carry weapons that can reshape matter at the molecular level, and our shields can deflect energy, equivalent to your sun's output, and we have faster than light travel and matter transmission capabilities." The demonstration continued for 30 minutes as the aliens showed technology that seemed like magic to the watching humans, and they levitated. Objects changed the molecular structure of metals and created complex machines from raw materials in seconds. Dr. Harper asked about their intentions, and Vextar explained that the Galactic Coalition had been expanding through this section of the galaxy for over 2,000 years, and they offered membership to species that showed potential and conquered those that posed threats or refused cooperation. Earth has 72 hours to decide, Vextar announced. You can join the Coalition as a client species and benefit from our technology and protection, or you can choose military conquest and incorporation by force, and resistance will only increase the casualties. Morrison felt his hands clench into fists, but he knew that anger was useless against such overwhelming power, and he watched the aliens return to their craft and lift off as smoothly as they had landed. Back aboard their ship, Vextar sent his report to the Coalition High Council, and he marked Earth as a Category 7 civilization with primitive technology and no significant defensive capabilities, and his recommendation was for standard incorporation protocols with minimal resistance expected. The humans show some interesting biological adaptability, he wrote, but their technology is centuries behind Coalition standards, and their military capabilities pose no threat to our operations, and conquest should be completed within 3 planetary rotations. The Coalition Council received the report with satisfaction because Earth would provide useful biological diversity, and the human population could serve various functions within their empire, and they approved the timeline and assigned additional resources to ensure smooth integration. General Ryan Hayes called an emergency meeting of world leaders, and the discussion was grim, as everyone understood that surrender meant becoming servants to an alien empire, while resistance meant certain destruction, and no one had any ideas for fighting. Technology so far beyond human capabilities. Dr. Harper listened to the debate, and she found herself thinking about the aliens' behavior during the demonstration, and something about their perfect efficiency bothered her, though she could not identify what it was, and she began reviewing the recorded footage looking for any detail that might help. They approach everything systematically, she told Morrison later. Every action was calculated and precise, and they seem to solve problems through pure logic and advanced technology, but I wonder if that might also be a limitation. Morrison was interested because military experience had taught him that every strength could also be a weakness, and he asked Harper to explain her thinking. What if they've never faced an enemy that didn't follow logical patterns? Harper suggested. What if their success comes from always fighting opponents who respond predictably to superior force? The idea was thin, but it was the only hope they had, and Morrison decided to explore it further, as Earth's governments continued debating whether to surrender or fight a hopeless war against impossible odds. Dr. Harper spent the next 18 hours reviewing every second of footage from the alien encounter, and she worked with Colonel Amy Foster, who specialized in psychological analysis of enemy behavior patterns, and together they watched the recordings, frame by frame, looking for anything that might give humanity an advantage. Look at this section, Harper said, pointing to the screen where Commander Vextar responded to questions about their technology. He answers every question with perfect logic, and gives exact technical specifications, but watch his reaction when that reporter asked about their art and culture. Foster leaned forward and saw the brief pause before Vextar dismissed the question as irrelevant to their discussion, and she noticed that all 3 aliens showed similar confusion when faced with concepts that had no practical military or technological purpose. They don't understand why humans would create things just for beauty or entertainment, Foster observed. When that child asked if they had pets, they looked at each other like they were trying to solve a complex equation. Captain Morrison joined them in the analysis room, and he brought coffee and sandwiches because none of them had eaten since the aliens left, and he sat down to watch the footage with fresh eyes, and his military background helped him notice different details. My grandfather Pete fought in 3 different wars, Morrison said, and he always told stories about how the best victories came from doing things the enemy never expected. And he said the most dangerous opponents were those who broke the rules and fought dirty. Foster pulled up profiles of successful military campaigns throughout human history, and she found patterns of smaller forces defeating larger ones through unconventional tactics and creative problem-solving, and she began to see connections to their current situation. The Mongols defeated much larger armies by using speed and mobility in ways their enemies couldn't predict, she explained. The American Revolution succeeded because the colonists refused to fight like European armies, and the Vietnamese won against superior technology by using tactics that didn't follow conventional military doctrine. Harper felt excitement building as the pattern became clear, and she realized that humanity's apparent weaknesses might actually be their greatest strengths, and she began formulating a theory about why the Galactic Coalition had been so successful against other species. Every species they've conquered probably fought them logically, she said. They tried to match technology with technology and strategy with strategy, but humans are different because we don't always act rationally, and we solve problems through creativity and emotion as much as logic. The three of them worked through the night developing their hypothesis, and they studied everything they could find about human behavior under stress and crisis situations, and the data supported their growing belief that unpredictability was humanity's secret weapon. Meanwhile, in cities around the world, people were reacting to the alien ultimatum in ways that surprised their own governments, and instead of panic and despair, many communities began organizing spontaneous festivals and art projects and massive collaborative efforts that seemed to have no logical connection to their desperate situation. In Tokyo, engineer Kenji Tanaka gathered his colleagues, and they started designing beautiful light displays using the city's infrastructure, and their goal wasn't military defense but rather creating something amazing that would lift people's spirits during humanity's darkest hour. In London, chef Mary Collins organized cooking events in public squares where people shared food and stories, and created temporary communities that brought joy and connection in the face of possible extinction. And she had no plan beyond making people feel less alone. Street musicians in New York began playing concerts that lasted all day and night, and artists painted murals on buildings, and children played elaborate games in parks while their parents watched alien ships overhead, and somehow these activities felt more important than hiding or preparing for war. Colonel Foster reviewed reports of similar activities from every major city, and she realized that humans were instinctively responding to existential threat through creativity and community building rather than traditional defensive measures. "This is what makes us different," she told Morrison and Harper. Other species probably responded to the coalition's ultimatum by mobilizing their militaries and trying to negotiate from positions of technological strength, but humans are responding by becoming more human. Harper expanded on the idea and suggested that the aliens' rigid logical approach made them vulnerable to opponents who operated outside predictable parameters, and she proposed that chaos and creativity might be more effective weapons than any technology Earth possessed. Morrison contacted General Hayes and requested permission to test their theory on a small scale, and he wanted to observe alien patrols that had been established around major population centers and see how they responded to unexpected human behavior. The first test came when a group of college students in Austin decided to hold an impromptu dance party in the street near an alien monitoring station, and Morrison watched through surveillance cameras as the Zephyrian guards struggled to categorize the threat level of 20 humans, moving rhythmically to loud music. The aliens scanned the dancers repeatedly and ran multiple analysis protocols, but their computers couldn't classify dancing as either hostile or non-hostile behavior, and the guards stood frozen for nearly an hour before requesting instructions from their commanders, who were equally puzzled. They don't know how to respond to behavior that serves no tactical purpose, Morrison realized. Their entire decision-making process is based on logical threat assessment and resource allocation, but dancing doesn't fit into any of their categories. Dr. Harper proposed expanding the test to include other forms of creative expression, and she coordinated with local leaders to organize activities that would be completely unpredictable but entirely non-threatening, and they wanted to see how widespread confusion they could create in the alien occupation forces. Artists began creating installations that combined technology with natural materials in ways that served no practical function but created beauty and wonder, and musicians composed songs that told stories about human dreams and fears, and writers shared poetry that expressed emotions the aliens had never encountered. The psychological impact on the Zephyrians was immediate and measurable, and Commander Vexitar found himself spending more time trying to understand human behavior Then planning military operations and his reports to the coalition became increasingly confused and contradictory. The humans continued to engage in activities that serve no survival purpose, he wrote. They create objects and sounds and movements that have no tactical value, and they gather in groups to share resources freely without any hierarchical command structure directing their behavior. The coalition's military analysts studied Vextar's reports, and they couldn't find precedent for a species that responded to conquest threats by increasing their cultural activities, and they began to question whether humans understood the seriousness of their situation. Back on Earth, Morrison and Harper realized they had discovered something unprecedented, and they began developing a comprehensive strategy based on weaponizing humanity's natural creativity and unpredictability. "We're not going to fight them with bullets or bombs," Morrison announced to the Emergency Council. "We're going to fight them with jazz music and street art and community gardens and flash mobs and everything that makes us human." General Hayes was skeptical because the approach seemed insane, but he was desperate enough to authorize the experiment, and he gave Morrison and Harper full resources to implement their unconventional defense. Plan Colonel Foster began training volunteers in what she called productive chaos, and she taught them how to be strategically unpredictable while maintaining coordination. And she explained that their goal was to create so much confusion that the aliens couldn't maintain operational effectiveness. The volunteers included teachers and artists and mechanics and students and retired grandmothers, and they all learned to think of creativity as their most powerful weapon. And they practiced turning ordinary activities into forms of resistance that couldn't be countered by superior technology. As word spread about the new strategy, people across the globe began contributing their own ideas, and humanity started preparing for the most unusual war in galactic history. The resistance began at exactly midnight Greenwich Mean Time, when every major city on Earth started what military historians would later call Operation Absurdity, and Captain Morrison coordinated from the command center while watching screens that showed alien monitoring stations around the world. In Tokyo, Kenji Tanaka activated his modified traffic control system, and suddenly every intersection in the city began displaying light patterns that pulsed in rhythm with classical music, and the lights created beautiful geometric shapes that served no traffic management purpose, but somehow kept vehicles moving more smoothly than before. The Zephyrian monitoring station registered the unusual energy patterns and immediately began scanning for weapons or communication systems, but their computers found nothing threatening, and they couldn't understand why humans would reprogram essential infrastructure to create art in London. Mary Collins had organized 300 volunteer cooks who emerged from subway stations carrying portable stoves and fresh ingredients, and they began preparing elaborate meals in public squares while singing traditional folk songs from dozens of different cultures. The aliens detected the coordinated movement and prepared for some kind of assault, but instead they watched humans sharing food with strangers and creating temporary communities around outdoor cooking fires, and the delicious aromas confused their chemical sensors, which were calibrated for sterile military environments. Former Special Forces operative Danny Rodriguez led teams in Los Angeles who had spent weeks learning improvisational theater techniques, and they appeared throughout the city performing elaborate scenarios that looked like military operations but were actually complex artistic performances. When alien patrols investigated what appeared to be tactical movements, they found humans engaged in storytelling exercises where they acted out heroic adventures and romantic comedies and historical events, and the Zephyrians stood watching these performances with complete bewilderment. Dr. Harper monitored the alien communications channels, and she heard growing frustration in their reports as field commanders struggled to explain situations that had no precedent in coalition military doctrine. Patrol Unit 7 reports humans gathering in Formation Delta, but they are not carrying weapons, and they appear to be producing rhythmic vocalizations while moving in synchronized patterns. One report stated, "Request classification and response protocol." Unable to provide classification, came the reply from Alien Command, "Continue observation and do not engage until threat level is determined." Kyaku. Pattern repeated across every continent as humans implemented increasingly creative forms of resistance, and programmer. Lisa Kim led teams of hackers who infiltrated alien communication networks, not to steal information or cause damage, but to fill their channels with poetry and music and abstract digital art. The Zephyrian technical specialists found their systems flooded with data that served no logical purpose, and they spent hours trying to decode hidden messages in human paintings and musical compositions and mathematical equations that described the flight patterns of birds' children, proved to be humanity's most effective warriors because their natural creativity was unlimited by adult concerns about looking foolish, and they invented games that somehow interfered with alien scanning equipment, while appearing to be nothing more than elaborate versions of tag and hide and seek. Morrison watched surveillance footage of kids in Chicago who had created a citywide game where they pretended to be different animals, and their movements created patterns that confused the alien tracking systems because the computers couldn't predict where a child pretending to be a butterfly would move next. Commander Vextar requested additional resources from the Coalition Council, and he tried to explain why his advanced military forces were struggling to maintain operational effectiveness against a species with primitive technology. The humans engage in coordinated activities that appear to serve no strategic purpose, he reported. They create temporary structures from recycled materials, and they gather to produce vocalizations that follow no logical communication protocol, and their behavior patterns change constantly without any central command authority. The Coalition's military advisors studied his reports, and they found no historical precedent for a species that increased their cultural activities when faced with extinction, and they began to suspect that Vextar was either incompetent or losing his psychological stability. Back on Earth, the resistance evolved beyond anything Morrison and Harper had originally planned, and entire cities began operating like massive improvisational theater, groups where everyone contributed to ongoing performances that blended art and daily life. Artist Carlos Mendez organized the most ambitious project when he coordinated with communities around the world to create a simultaneous global expression of human creativity. And at exactly noon on the third day, millions of people began dancing and singing and painting and writing. The event had no military purpose and no tactical objective, but somehow it created a planet-wide celebration of everything that made humanity unique, and the aliens watched in amazement as Earth transformed into a living work of art. The psychological impact on the Zephyrian forces was devastating, because they had never encountered opponents who became stronger and more unified when faced with superior firepower, and their rigid military training had not prepared them for enemies who fought through joy and creativity. Several alien soldiers began requesting transfer to other assignments because prolonged exposure to human unpredictability was causing them to question their own behavioral patterns, and they found themselves wondering about concepts like beauty and humor that had no place in Coalition doctrine. Colonel Foster documented these changes, and she realized that humanity was winning a war they didn't even know they were fighting. And the aliens' greatest strength was becoming their weakness, as their logical systems failed to process illogical but effective human behavior. Military units led by sergeants like Kevin Brooks and Maria Santos abandoned traditional tactics completely, and they began treating every operation like a community art project where success was measured by creativity rather than destruction when alien patrols approached. Human positions, they found installations that looked like military fortifications, but functioned as interactive sculptures and community centers where people gathered to share stories and create music and solve problems together. The Zephyrians' advanced AI systems began malfunctioning because they were designed to predict enemy behavior based on logical decision-making, but human actions appeared random while somehow achieving coordinated results that no computer could calculate. Dr. Harper made a breakthrough discovery when she analyzed psychological profiles of the Coalition species, and she found that they had all evolved in environments that rewarded efficiency and eliminated emotional volatility and creative unpredictability as wasteful traits. They optimized themselves into a corner, she explained to Morrison. They became so focused on logical problem-solving that they lost the ability to adapt to situations that require creative thinking and emotional intelligence. The ice. Global resistance reached its climax when submarine captain Ellen Parker surfaced her vessel in New York Harbor and began broadcasting human music across all coalition communication frequencies, and the simple act of sharing Earth's cultural diversity created cascade failures in alien command structures throughout the solar system. Commander Vexitar found his own thought patterns changing as he listened to the music, and he began experiencing emotions that his species had eliminated millennia ago, when he realized that humanity represented something the galaxy had lost and desperately needed to rediscover. The Galactic Coalition's High Council convened an emergency session aboard their massive command vessel, and 12 different species sent their most senior military leaders to discuss what they were calling the Earth problem, and Admiral Zefkol of the Andromedian fleet reviewed reports that made no sense according to any known principles of warfare. Commander Vextar reports that human resistance grows stronger when attacked. Admiral Zefkol read from the official documentation, military units have been defeated by what he describes as elaborate pranks, and entire cities have transformed their defensive strategies into public art projects. The crystalline delegate Sharthex clicked with disapproval as she reviewed tactical analyses that showed Zephyrian forces becoming less effective the longer they remained on Earth, and several patrol units had requested reassignment after their commanders began exhibiting erratic behavior. Perhaps the humans possessed some form of mental manipulation technology, suggested war leader Krexthan from the hegemony worlds. Their primitive appearance may be designed to make us underestimate advanced psychological weapons, but Admiral Zefkol had studied the reports carefully, and he knew the situation was far more troubling than enemy technology, because the humans appeared to be changing coalition forces simply by being themselves, and their cultural activities were somehow contagious. Down on Earth, Captain Morrison and Dr. Harper had been captured during a reconnaissance mission near the main alien command post, and they expected imprisonment or interrogation, but instead they found themselves in comfortable quarters being visited by curious Zephyrian officers who asked strange questions. Guard Commander Torval had overseen 12 successful conquest campaigns, but he had never encountered prisoners who seemed genuinely interested in learning about their captors, and Morrison and Harper engaged him in conversations about philosophy and art and the nature of existence. Why do humans create objects that serve no survival function? Torval asked during one of their discussions. We have observed your species expending significant resources to produce what you call music and paintings and sculptures, but these items provide no tactical advantage. Harper explained that beauty and creativity were essential to human happiness and well-being, and that art helped people understand themselves and their place in the universe, and she watched Torval struggle to process concepts that had no equivalent in coalition thinking. Morrison shared stories about human history and culture, and he described how sports and games taught cooperation and competition, and how festivals and celebrations strengthened community bonds and brought people together across different backgrounds. The conversations continued for days, and Torval found himself experiencing something unprecedented in his military career, as he began to question whether the coalition's methods were the only valid approach to organizing civilization. Back on Earth, the resistance had evolved into something that defied all military classification, and cities operated like massive improvisational communities where everyone contributed to ongoing cultural expressions that blended practical needs with artistic vision. Military Commander Kevin Brooks led units that had abandoned traditional tactics completely, and his soldiers now approached every mission as an opportunity to create something beautiful. While achieving their objectives, and their success rate increased dramatically. In Detroit, former auto worker turned community organizer Maria Santos helped transform abandoned factories into centers for collaborative art projects where people built sculptures from recycled materials, while discussing solutions to urban problems, and alien patrols found these installations impossible to classify as either threats or non-threats. Coalition's advanced AI systems experienced processing failures when they tried to predict human behavior, because the same individuals would make logical decisions in some situations and completely irrational choices in others, and the computers couldn't identify consistent patterns. Colonel Foster documented how alien forces were being affected by prolonged exposure to human creativity, and she found evidence that coalition soldiers were beginning to rediscover emotional responses that their species had suppressed through genetic modification and social conditioning. They're not just failing to understand us. Foster explained to General Hayes. "They're starting to change and become more like us, and their own command structure is breaking down because their soldiers are developing individual personalities and questioning orders." The transformation was most visible among the Zephyrian forces who had been on Earth the longest, and Commander Vextar himself had begun experiencing what he called uncertainty episodes, where he found himself unable to make decisions based purely on logical analysis. Admiral Zefkol arrived with reinforcements from the Andromedan fleet, and he brought additional ships and weapons that could destroy Earth cities from orbit. But when he assessed the tactical situation, he discovered that his own crews were becoming contaminated by human unpredictability. Soldiers who had followed orders without question for decades suddenly started asking why and experimenting with creative solutions to routine problems, and work units that had operated with mechanical precision began developing distinct personalities and preferences. The Admiral ordered strict isolation protocols to prevent further exposure, but human cultural broadcasts were reaching coalition forces throughout the solar system, and music and art and poetry were spreading through their communication networks. Like a beneficial virus, Captain Morrison and Dr. Harper were released by their captors, who had become friends and allies, and they returned to Earth's command center with valuable intelligence about the coalition's internal problems. "They're falling apart," Morrison reported to the Emergency Council. "Their entire society is based on suppressing the very qualities that make us human, and prolonged contact with our culture is causing them to rediscover parts of themselves they lost centuries ago." Harper added that several alien species were experiencing what psychologists would recognize as cultural awakening, as they encountered human concepts of individual expression and emotional authenticity and creative problem-solving. The Coalition High Council faced a crisis unlike anything in their military history, because their forces were not being defeated by superior weapons, but were instead being transformed by exposure to a completely different way of thinking about existence. Admiral Zefkol made the unprecedented decision to visit Earth personally, because he needed to understand what made humanity so uniquely disruptive, and he expected to find advanced weapons or hidden technologies that explained their impossible effectiveness. He landed at Edwards Air Force Base with a small escort and demanded to meet with human leaders. But instead of a military briefing, he was taken on a tour that included schools and museums and parks and community centers. The Admiral watched children playing games that had no winners or losers, and he observed artists creating sculptures from materials that other species would consider waste, and he listened to musicians performing songs that told stories about human dreams and fears and hopes. The experience that changed everything happened in a small park where an elderly man named Frank Johnson was teaching his granddaughter to fly a kite, and Admiral Zefkol watched the simple interaction between the generations and realized what his species had lost: the child's laughter as the kite soared and dipped in the wind, and the grandfather's patient encouragement when she struggled with the string, and the pure joy they shared in a moment that served no practical purpose, showed the Admiral something he had never understood about the nature of intelligence and civilization. That evening, Admiral Zefkol sat alone in his quarters, and for the first time in his long military career, he wondered whether conquering other species was the right path for galactic development. 6 months after first contact, Admiral Zefkol stood before the Galactic Coalition High Council and delivered a report that would change the course of galactic civilization, and his words carried the weight of someone who had discovered a fundamental truth about the nature of intelligence and progress. "The humans have taught us something we forgot long ago," he announced to the assembled delegates. "We optimized our species for efficiency and logical thinking, but in doing so we eliminated our capacity for growth and adaptation and creativity, and the very qualities we saw as weaknesses are actually the source of their greatest strengths." Commander Vextar had undergone the most dramatic transformation of any coalition officer, and he now called himself Victor, at the suggestion of his human friends, and he served as an ambassador between species who were learning to rediscover their own suppressed emotional capabilities. The fracturing of coalition unity had begun when member species exposed to human culture started questioning the rigid hierarchies and logical absolutism that governed their societies and entire worlds, began experimenting with concepts like individual expression and collaborative problem-solving. Dr. Harper worked with a team of xenobiologists to establish the Galactic Cultural Exchange Program, and instead of conquest or surrender, they proposed voluntary cooperation based on mutual learning, rather than hierarchical domination, and the response from reformed coalition worlds was overwhelmingly positive. Captain Morrison found himself serving as a military advisor to species that wanted to understand how humans achieved tactical success through unconventional methods, and he taught courses in creative problem-solving and adaptive strategy at the new Interstellar Academy. The crystalline civilization had been among the most rigid in the coalition, but after exposure to human music, they rediscovered their natural ability to create harmonic resonances, and their crystal cities began producing sounds of incredible beauty that enhanced rather than replaced their technological achievements. The hegemony worlds released their genetic modifications that had suppressed emotional responses, and their people began experiencing feelings and relationships that had been engineered out of their species for over 1,000 years, and their art and literature flourished for the first time in millennia. Earth became the unofficial capital of cultural development for the galaxy, and human teachers like former pilot Rachel Stone and engineer Tony Kim traveled to other worlds to help alien species reconnect with their own creative potentials. The transformation wasn't without challenges, because some coalition hardliners viewed the changes as dangerous weakness, and they attempted to maintain the old system through force, but their efforts failed when their own soldiers began adopting human approaches to conflict resolution. The breakthrough came when artist Carlos Mendez organized the first Galactic Art Festival, and representatives from 43 different worlds collaborated to create installations that combined their unique biological and technological capabilities with human concepts of beauty and meaning. The festival lasted for 3 months, and it featured music that incorporated the harmonic abilities of the crystallines with human emotional expression, and sculptures that used Andromedian matter manipulation technology to create forms inspired by human dreams and poetry. Former war leader Crexton became one of the most enthusiastic converts to the new approach, and he established peace academies throughout his home system, where former soldiers learned to resolve conflicts through negotiation and creative compromise rather than superior firepower. The signing of the Galactic Cooperation Accord took place on Earth in a ceremony that combined formal diplomacy with celebratory festival, and representatives from every species contributed traditional foods and music and art to create a truly collaborative event. Admiral Zefkol served as the primary coalition signatory, and he had requested to use a human name for the ceremony, and he chose the name David to honor the biblical story of a small opponent defeating a much larger enemy through unconventional methods. The Accord established principles of voluntary association and cultural exchange, and mutual benefit rather than conquest. And it created institutions for sharing knowledge and resources while respecting the unique contributions of each species. Harper was appointed as the first director of interspecies cultural development, and her mandate was to facilitate the kind of creative collaboration that had transformed the galaxy from a hierarchical empire into a community of equals. The most remarkable change occurred among the Zephyrians, who had been the primary military force for coalition expansion, and they evolved from conquest specialists into cultural facilitators who helped other species discover their own creative potentials. Children proved to be the most effective ambassadors for the new galactic culture because their natural creativity and openness transcended species boundaries, and exchange programs brought young beings from different worlds together to learn and play and create. The former commander Vextar, now Victor, established the first interspecies school on Earth where students from dozens of different worlds learned together, and their collaborative projects produced innovations that no single species could have achieved independently. Colonel Foster continued her research into the psychological factors that made the transformation possible, and she discovered that all intelligent species possessed creative potential, but most had suppressed these abilities in favor of technological efficiency. The galaxy's new approach to problem-solving combined logical analysis with creative exploration and emotional intelligence, and the result was technological advancement that served not just practical needs, but also enhanced quality of life for all species. Trade relationships evolved from resource extraction and technological exchange to cultural collaboration, where species shared art and music and literature alongside scientific knowledge and industrial products. Captain Morrison reflected on the transformation during the first anniversary celebration of the Accord, and he realized that humanity's secret weapon had never been hidden at all, but was simply their refusal to abandon the messy and unpredictable and joyful aspects of consciousness. The victory belonged not to human military superiority, but to the universal power of creativity and emotional authenticity, and the willingness to find strength in vulnerability and beauty in chaos, and solutions in spaces where pure logic would find only problems. Former Guard Commander Torval established a museum on his home world dedicated to preserving the memory of the old coalition system, while celebrating the new culture of cooperation, and he often said that humans had given the galaxy permission to be imperfect and wonderful. The final scene of this transformation took place in the same small park where Admiral Zefkol had watched Frank Johnson teaching his granddaughter to fly a kite. And now children from 12 different species played together while their parents exchanged stories about their world's victor. Sat on a bench with his watercolor paints creating landscapes that combined the geometric precision of his Zephyrian heritage with the emotional expressiveness he had learned from humans, and children's laughter echoed across a universe that had remembered how to dream. The galaxy had discovered that their greatest achievements came not from perfecting logical systems, but from embracing the beautiful chaos of consciousness and creativity, and the knowledge that intelligence without wonder was merely computation, while intelligence with joy was the foundation of true civilization.